Herb did an awful lot of work for our beautiful community behind the scenes.
Herb Schaper is one of the icons of New Ulm baseball and New Ulm sports.
Somebody said he's like the Energizer Bunny. He just doesn't wind down.
And Herb was a person of detail.
I think probably he may be one of the best ambassadors that New Ulm ever had.
Herb was a great historian.
Herb was a passionate sports fan, a very passionate baseball man too in New Ulm.
And I know Herb, really, he loved Johnson Park and he loved baseball.
Herb not only was a mentor, but also a friend.
So I did the country music on Saturday afternoons, and of course you get a lot of requests in back then because block format was what a lot of stations did. You didn't have the kind of formats and certainly the kind of FM radio music that you have today. So I would get requests and dedications. All of a sudden one day, on a Saturday, this guy come walking up into the station. It was Herb Schaper, introduced himself. And he said, Jim, I put the country music show together at the county fair every year. And I'm curious, who do you get the most requests for? What musicians? I said, Herb, there's no question. There is one group that gets the most dedication requests. It was the Statler brothers. Herb went about getting the Statler brothers in for the Brown County Fair. And we had not one, two sellout shows. Two sellout shows. He brought him back another time, and if I remember right, the price tag the second time had gone from $20,000 to $40,000. Now, by today's standards, it doesn't match up to anything. But back then, for a little Brown County Fair to stick out $40,000 for the Statler brothers, who had been here once earlier, are you nuts? Well, Herb had to sell it to the fair board. We had not only one sellout show, we had two sellout shows again.
It was an honor on the 21st of December 2019 to be at the Legion when Herb was inducted into the Legion Baseball Hall of Fame. It was an honor for me to be there, to have him inducted into the Hall of Fame, but I think the biggest honor of all was when Mrs. Schaper and her family stood there and accepted that plaque in Herb's name and honor. And I just thought it was classic. I wish the whole world could see that. If everybody only knew behind the scenes how much time and effort Herb put into baseball here in New Ulm. And I was going to be asking Herb to be on a committee for a fundraiser here now in 2020 because there's been a lot of time and effort and money spent on the Johnson Park improvements, which is going to make it a classic ballpark again. And of course, he's now playing in the Field of Dreams and looking down at us and going, you guys are number one, but he's really number one.
And whenever I had a question or I needed information, I could contact Herb. And most of the time within 24 hours, he had the information I needed. He was he just dearly loved the game of baseball. And he put it at the top of his list that he was going to make New Ulm baseball very important, not only to himself, but to everybody in New Ulm and the New Ulm area.
Now, I wind up here in New Ulm, Minnesota, and guess what? Guys that were playing AA ball are now playing for Waseca, playing for Fairmont, playing for Austin, playing all over. And Herb got to know all of them. He was a good sports editor, worked hard, also served in the Army, and he was a soldier friend of Bert Shopicum, who later became our police officer and mayor of New Ulm. And Herb also was well known by all the basketball, football coaches. Well, let's take it from Fairmont, Waseca, all the way up to Hutchinson, Glencoe, Silver Lake. And Herb did an excellent job in covering the sporting events that were being played here.
It's my understanding that he started shagging balls down in Johnson Park as a youngster. I think that's what started a long passion, love affair with Johnson Park. When New Ulm celebrated Johnson Park's 50th anniversary, Herb chaired that committee. Just a few years ago when we celebrated its 75th, Herb was on that committee, and he also created over 20 videos about all the championship teams that New Ulm has had.
A number of years ago, we celebrated 75 years at Johnson Park. And it was a production that there many people were part of it. We got raves review from it. But the reality is that 90% of that information was gotten and processed by Herb Schaper. Without him, it would not have been the near success that it was. I do believe that, and something that I would really like to see, is Herb Schaper inducted into the Minnesota Amateur Baseball Hall of Fame. I think it's long overdue, and it has to be done posthumously. But he certainly is deserving. And I think he is as deserving, if not more deserving, than many other people who have been inducted into halls of fame such as this. Herb was the longtime historian, did a great deal for the game of baseball, and it certainly was a great loss when he passed away. And I'm hoping that down the road here, he can still be recognized.
And I remember the last time I talked to Herb was around 2018. I ran into him in the grocery store, and he knew I kept in touch with some of the other former employees from Master Graphics, and he was saying, well, we got a 40-year anniversary of when I purchased the business coming up. I'd really like to get the whole gang together. And that was one thing. He always liked to have a good party. That was one thing about Herb. He always liked to have a good party. As far as I know, he never got that accomplished, but that was the last time I saw Herb, and I'm grateful. That was really one of my first real jobs I ever had.
Herb started the New Ulm Sports Central, and I became involved with that. So over a span of 60 years, Herb and I were very close friends.
The memory I have most about Herb is he talked to me one day about wanting to start a New Ulm Sports Central website. And I kind of thought, Herb, that's just a big undertaking. But if you know Herb, once he got an idea in his head, he was going to run with it. And I told Herb, that's a lot of work you have to do to try and get all that sports information on your website. Well, you can't tell Herb no, because Herb is going to do it. And Herb, on his own, organized the New Ulm Sports Central website, got it up and running, and right now it's still on the website, but he did a lot of research, a lot of work in getting that thing up and running.
Herb was absolutely one of my mentors. There were probably 3 main mentors outside of the radio business for me in New Ulm, and Herb was one of them. Very smart. Went to Twins games a few times. That'll take me to one more story about Herb Schaper. If you looked at Herb and you looked at Sid Hartman, Minneapolis Tribune, CCO Radio, all that, very striking resemblance between the two. Very striking resemblance. Well, Herb and his son Blake and my son Adam, we started doing an annual thing. We would go to a Twins game. All right, on this particular trip, we stopped at Whiskey River in St. Peter. And we're going to have a beverage before we come home. Blake and Herb and my son Adam and I. And I said, guys, just kind of follow my lead. And so as the bartender came over, I said, I'd like to have this beverage, and Blake and Adam will have that. And I said, we got a celebrity along with us. Do you think the bar would be okay to set up a beverage for my friend Sid Hartman? Oh, yes, Mr. Hartman, we'd be happy to set up a beverage for you. What would you like? We played that straight until we walked out the door. Herb looked like Sid. We got the free beverage. We laugh about it to this day. When Herb passed away, I was out of town on a baseball tour. I wasn't able to make his funeral, unfortunately. But I shared on an email back to his son Blake about our Sid Hartman story and experience. And to this day, the Bartle Schaper team still goes to a Twins game every year. And Blake and his son have been going for a few years because Herb wasn't as mobile anymore and kind of felt a little bit out of place by not being able to walk as fast. And so he didn't come with us the last few years, but he's always been with us in memory. And we will continue to have the Bartle Schaper Twins trip. We have it scheduled for 2020, and I think it'll be scheduled for a long time. And Herb and I got that going and have enjoyed that. It was a real pleasure to be a part of that.
And it was a wonderful all these years, I'll tell you. He's a guy, when he did something, he wants to do it right or not at all. And I'm kind of that little of that mold myself. I know when I have kept the stats and all that too, I like to get it right, not kind of halfways and then, well, the rest will work out and that. Well, it doesn't always work out that way. So that's how I met Herb, and it was a wonderful relationship. And not only was it in baseball, we went through the basketball, and he started out as Sports Central, and he used a lot of my information. It was his handwritten information. And all of this was basically put into the computer, and it's now people can look at it, look it up, and that it's all stored away. And like I say, he was the most wonderful guy to work with there, and we always had some conversation at the end of it, and he thanked me for it.
And one thing about Herb, he was a people person. He was somebody that you start talking to, and pretty soon whatever he was talking about, you wanted to be part of it. And he was up and down Main Street all the time. And then I left in '72, I think it was, went to Fairfax for a couple of years, but moved back to New Ulm again, and there he was again. He says, we need a manager again for baseball, this time New Ulm Kaiserhof. So that went on and everything, and it was a case of then we always would stop over before the ball game or before we went out of town, and Herb and I'd go next door. I forget the name of the tavern. They had a little 10-cent beers, you know. We always had a strategy. It wasn't having a beer, it was having strategy. And because he definitely would have an input. And I appreciated it and everything because there was a lot going on and everything. And all of a sudden, we were doing very well. And then in 1984, I was promoted to my job and left town, went to La Crosse, and didn't hear from Herb too much. I read a little bit about it in the paper and everything, but all of a sudden, 1990, he says, you got to come back to town. I said, what for? He says, well, you're going to be put into New Ulm Baseball Hall of Fame. So here was Herb again, watching out for Ken.
So years ago, I grew up in New Ulm, left, was gone for about 10 years in college, and returned to New Ulm. Me and my wife, Colleen, returned to New Ulm in 1989, and I started working with computers, and several people around town told me to look up Herb Schaper regarding computers. And it turns out that Herb, as always, is an early adopter, and he had one of the first computer businesses in town alongside his printing business. So I went and talked to Herb, and we hit it off right away. We had one thing in common besides computers, and that was baseball. And he was working on the 50th anniversary of Johnson Park at that time. And so I would say that Herb was a business mentor for me, but also a volunteer mentor for me. He's been involved in so many different things in the community and outside the community. It's amazing. I had the honor of nominating and helping put together the nomination to the Minnesota State Amateur Baseball Hall of Fame for him. And we literally had a book that we presented to that committee. And it was filled with all the things that Herb's done over the years in his life. Very interesting life.
Many times I went up to Herb's place at the end of 10th North, and you couldn't get past the gate because Herb was working on a project. It was like a sentinel that stopped you. You didn't ever drive down to the house. You may or may not have gotten in to talk to him immediately, and he was the one that called you up because he had a project that he was working on. And that, I guess, is what I remember most about Herb. There was always a project, and sometimes I had to tell him, Herb, I'm head coach in 2 sports and assistant in football and department head, and I plain just don't have the time that you want from me to do things. However, he's a great man, tremendous influence on a lot of people in sports in New Ulm, and like John Vetter said before me, he's not in the Amateur Hall of Fame, but he's going to be because he has had a significant impact on New Ulm baseball history in all aspects, high school, Legion, amateur, you name it.
It was tough to out-talk him. I'll miss him.
I think that's it. I keep talking for a couple hours on Herb Schaper. That's all for now.